Okay, everyone. Good afternoon. Maybe we can start settling so long so that we can start the next session. Okay, so we have one talk in the session on land use impacts on wildlife space use patterns. And this is a talk by Lane Pardo. We'll be looking at the influence of landscapes around reserves on jackals in South Africa. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I know this is a tricky time for a conference. It's the last day after lunch, a beautiful scene, so thank you very much. Before you fall asleep, so I'm going to talk about jackals distribution in South Africa. So as you know, human has affected biodiversity in many different ways, at fine scale, at large scale, directly and indirectly. However, some animals have managed to adapt to some anthropogenic landscape. Actually, some of these animals thrive in urban environments, for example. However, despite this tolerance, we know that protected areas are the main tool to protect biodiversity. This is the main refuge for biodiversity, and there's no doubt. However, there is some pressure in the outside. What happened in the surrounding of the reserve can also affect the dynamic of species at the interior of the reserve. There's evidence, for example, that the rate of mortality in the reserve can be higher at the borders of the reserve. Also, there's something called ecological traps. So, for example, animals who dare to go outside the reserve, they are more likely to be killed, therefore affecting all the dynamic inside the reserve. So the question that remains is then how this process occurring around the reserve impact the ecological dynamic of some species. We have to have in mind as well that animals don't respond only to the environmental factors. They can be mediated by the community. And the most common or popular concept is the top-down control, which is basically the effect that has top predators over the remaining levels in the trophic web. It can be positive, it can be negative, but the thing is that these factors can interact in one or another way, in a particular scale or in a different scales. In this sense, South Africa is very particular because we have a lot of carnivore management, and also the borders are sharper, but also you put fences around the reserve, so that has some different implications. So we thought the black-backed jackal could be a good model to check on those factors, how the top predator, the land uses, the habitat interact to determine the presence and the distribution of this animal, right? As we know, this is a very tolerant and generalist species. It can cross the reserve regardless of different situations. That's what we want to see, whether these surrounding matrix affect that probability of having the jackals occupying a reserve. It also has an important relationship with carnivores. It can be positive, it can be negative as well. It can be in this photo, for example, that we took, these jackals stay there for probably the whole day waiting for the lion to leave the carcass there for him to take advantage, right? So the study was motivated by that, and the idea was to understand how the context surrounding the reserve influenced the occupancy of these jackals across South Africa, and how important is the presence of these top predators inside the reserve in this behavior, no? And compare different scales. This project is based on the Snapshot Safari project. This is a large network of camera traps across the country. We have about 30 sites, 30 reserve, and some of them are for monitoring purpose, another one for single service. We use for this study 15 reserve. In each of the reserve we have between 15 to 20 cameras, and they are placed for about 3 months for this study in particular. So we were interested in fine scale variables. Those are the ones that act at the camera level, and then some variables at the coarse scale. So we call it at the reserve level. For the fine scale, we were interested in characterizing the habitat attribute. That would be the proxies for bottom-up processes. So percentage of tree cover, distance to the borders, presence of large predators. We only use lion, hyena, and leopard, and also the predator regions. There's evidence that it's not just the presence of one species, but also there's some predictions that if you have more predators species, then the influence of these species will be higher on mesopredators in particular. And then at coarse scale, we have variables inside the reserve that characterize the whole reserve, which are basically the same as the fine scale, but at the reserve level, plus reserve size and reserve age. Then for the outside, to understand the matrix influence on the context inside the reserve, we constructed a buffer of 1 kilometer across the reserve. And we choose some variables that can be a surrogate for human impacts. In this case, for example, basically the context of land use. So we use human population density, the proportion of agriculture, the infrastructure, and so on. Those images were, or those variables were extracted from MODIs, from some information from sand parks, and for the world population estimate that is available online as well. Sorry. We were interested in occupancy, which is basically a parameter, a population parameter that describes the probability of a site being occupied by a species or the proportion of the area occupied by a particular species. This is a model that has two components, basically one that is allow for the detection probability, and that's probably the most important part of this model, which we can account for those situations where we don't detect the species, but it doesn't mean that the species is not there. And then we have an occupancy part, which is the ecological factor, which is the one we are really interested in, the occupancy part. And that's formulated with some distribution called Bernoulli and so on. So for the detection probability, we use three cover, camera days, and flash type. So for example, if we have more cover, if the area is more dense, and if the animal is present, we would expect that that would probably affect a little bit the detection probability. The same with camera days. If you leave cameras for longer time, you will have more chances to detect the species. So we have to include those things. To understand which of the variables were more important in describing or driving the jackal occupancy, we use a model selection approach using a KK information criteria for small samples, and we use a threshold of 2. So it basically means anything below 2, AIC2, will be considered robust to as an explanation for that variability in jackal occupancy. In the end, we constructed 22 models, basically univariate, so one variable, but a few of them kind of grouping some hypotheses related to characteristics that can be resemble some characteristics. Right. So what we got, jackals were well distributed across the reserve. As you can see, we had detections in 13 of the 15 reserve, but the detections varied considerably, from 4 to 30 per site. If you can see here, for example, the area of Karoo, Kemap, Kandebu, Mountain Zebra, and Kalahari, these are the areas where there's more probability of finding the jackal. Where in Kruger, the probability is not very high. Is it because of the lions? Is it because of the landscape? That's one of the things that we wanted to see. So no, it's basically surprising that the most important factor was actually only 3 cover at the site level, so fine scale variable. It was a robust model with more than 60% of the support, followed by the model considering the distance to the borders, which is a proxy for edge effects. But we have to be cautious with that model because the distance to the border, it had a slow coefficient and a bit of high standard error. So in the end, it's not very meaningful, which basically suggests that 3 cover is basically the most important driver here. For the detection probability, we don't really care too much about that. We just want to model it. But 3 cover and camera days, basically 3 cover. And camera days also have an important effect on the detection probability. So this is the detection probability. The probability of occupancy of jackal, and this is the 3 cover. So as we can see, there is a negative relationship. So as the vegetation gets denser, the probability of the jackal decreases. If you want to see this explicitly in a map, we can see here all the probability with the best model for the jackal occupancy across South Africa. But we basically have also the reserve in each of the areas and the probability of occupancy. But that we can summarize that map basically saying that Kalahari and Karoo biomes are actually the biomes where jackals are more prone to be found, instead of the Bushman or some kind of bushy vegetation. So yeah, only tree cover was the one that determined the main important driver for jackal occupancy at this scale. There was no evidence of jackals being influenced by the anthropogenic matrix, as we thought. You know, if jackals really prefer to go around the matrix, that could suggest that, for example, areas or reserves that are surrounding my more anthropogenic landscape will be more occupied. But we didn't find any. The reserve characteristic, nothing, and the presence of carnivores was also surprising, not important as a driver of jackal occupancy. Some of these things might be related to the lethal management of the jackals. It seems that at local scale, even the lethal management don't affect the population of jackals. So maybe at large scale, this is also what is occurring. We confirmed that jackals are very tolerant species. They can move across different land uses. In some studies, they found that they can move around 110 farms. The animals that have been radio tracked, they can occupy more than 21% of the points outside the reserve. So yeah, our results also confirm that they can move basically freely across the reserve. It is also possible that the territorial behavior of this species influenced the fact that the fine scale variable was the only one that come up as a best explanation. Okay, we found then that bottom-up might be more important than the presence of predators. And this is something that was interesting. Usually most studies suggest that top predator has an important effect on mesopredators. However, some of these studies only consider the community variables, and they forget about the relation of the environment. In this case, we try to compensate on that, and we put everything in the same plate and to see which one was more important. However, and we see that the bottom up was more important in terms of the vegetation and so on. If we consider only the carnivores, then we find that the relationship is negative at the reserve level. That's basically confirming what other studies suggest. Most of the time, the relation with mesopredators is negative. That's also, that corresponds with current literature. But at the side level, the relationship can change. It can be positive for lion and leopard. So there's something in there. But again, this was not the most important driver. This can be related to the fact that diet of the jackals it's complex. It can be influenced by bottom-up and top-down processes, so small prey, but also the presence of the top predator. So with this kind of generalist species, it's very difficult to find a particular driver of these things. And that's what we can also see in this research. We believe that it would be nice to combine all the kind of descriptors for the landscape. We try to find information about the farms, like area, type of cattle, and so on, but this information is simply not available. And it will be interesting also to find out the relationship with mesopredators. We know that bat-eared fox and jackals don't really go along very well. So in general, we confirm that jackal is a very plastic species. It can move around the matrix without any problem, at least between the reserve, which is what we were interested on. And the scale at which the effects were more evident was at a local scale. That also helped us to consider that the management of this species, which is very general and some drivers are not super clear sometimes, is better to address at each context or each local scale, not necessarily at the landscape or wide country level, because the things with jackal are probably more localized. And thank you very much.
Cool. Thank you so much, Lane. We have 1 minute for one quick question, if anyone has one. Okay. No. Thanks so much, Lane. Okay, so next up we'll be going to the last session, looking at plant and animal traits and how they respond to disturbance. And up first we have Mtokozisi Moyo, who will be looking at these traits and how they respond to rainfall seasonality across Africa. Thanks, Mto.
Can I hold this? Yes, please.
Need some help.
Just wanna hold. Yeah, I just wanna hold it in my hand. Yeah. Hello, everyone. My name is Mtokozisi Moyo, and I'll be presenting on plant and animal traits associated with rainfall seasonality in Africa. So what is seasonality? Seasonality is a predictable yearly cycle of an environmental variable such as temperature and rainfall, and influences several variables such as biodiversity, community structure and composition, as well as ecosystem functions and population dynamics. We get two types of seasonality, or I'm going to focus on two types of seasonality. We get temperature seasonality, where it's determined by how hot or cold it is. And then you get wet-dry seasonality that speaks to the amount of rainfall that there is. Not just the amount of rainfall, but also how that rainfall is distributed throughout the year. So that's the one which we're going to be focusing on in this particular talk. But before I get into that, there are some changes that happen in the Earth. So we believe that the onset of a pronounced wet-dry season occurred sometime about 7 million years during the Miocene. And as you can see from this figure over here, these are some of the changes that happened throughout the Earth as in order for seasonality to be there. So you get things like warming of the Earth, you get drops in sea level, and then that also led to the evolution of certain plants and animals. And with that, and the emergence of seasonality, of course, as I already mentioned. And with that, those plants and animals have to develop traits in order to be able to deal with this newfound seasonality that there is. So in this particular, I can say the aim of this talk basically is to identify which traits are important for organisms to survive in a wet, dry seasonal environment. As you can see from the pictures, how can you survive in an environment like this compared to an environment like this? And also, the other aim of this experiment, of this particular review, is to also develop theories around life history strategies. Are we able to group these traits into some form of life history strategy, as this is something that has not been attempted, at least in my opinion, anyway. So if we're thinking about traits of seasonality, functional traits are morphological, biochemical, and phenological or behavioral characteristics that might be considered relevant for an organism to survive in an environment. So there's so many strategies that have been used to try and group functional traits. One classic one is Grimes' CSR strategy, where we get competitors, stress tolerators, and rudderals. And this was done for plants. And we also attempted to come up with a similar kind of strategy that is loosely based on this particular triangle here, where we actually split those characteristics into three groups, which are tolerance. So tolerance traits are traits where an organism tries to survive in that stressful environment. Flexibility, organism is able to switch between strategies in order to deal with seasonality. And avoidance is where an organism will totally run away from where the stress is. I'll explain these further as I go along. So to do that, I did a literature search from the different search engines, and also held a traits workshop with some of the people that are in this room, actually. And in that particular workshop, we tried to discuss what traits the specialists thought were important to survive in a seasonal environment. As well, they also help inform the search terms for the literature search. And within the literature, I also found the papers that were cited in that literature search, so in order to build the database. So from the literature search, I read a total of 147. Actually, I didn't read 147 papers. These are the ones that made it into the review. I read way more than that. And the one thing I just want to point out here is that there's a serious bias for Southern Africa. And if you dig deeper, most of the studies have actually been done here. And I don't know if it's because this is where I stay, that's why I focus mostly on that, or maybe there's not that much literature from other parts of Africa. So that's just one thing I just wanted to point out in this particular review, that as much as it is speaking about Africa, it could have a strong Southern Africa bias. So from the traits that we found, I'll just go through these very quickly from the three groups, and I'll explain as I go. So we have avoidance traits, the orange, or is it, orange or brown. Those are traits that are seen in animals, and then the green traits are the ones that are seen in plants. So you get traits such as migration. Just to mention before I go on explaining, so with most of these traits, there are a lot of individual traits, but here I try to group them into general groups. So something like migration also includes timing of migration, or like short-term migrations, or long-distance migrations. So it's just a general term. There are so many traits under most of these particular traits that are there. So for example, we have migration, or we have examples such as changing in movement patterns, something like changing in activity, where certain, for example, with animals, they change how they behave in the dry season compared to the wet season. And also in plants, you get something like deciduousness, where trees drop their leaves in order to avoid the lack of water. And then we get flexibility traits as well. So something like diet switching in animals. So this includes a lot of groups, because you get mixed feeders that switch from grazing to browsing during the dry season. You get animals that also eat food which they normally wouldn't eat if other food sources were available. You get animals that diversify their diet, so that's everything under that particular group. And then also in plants, flexibility. Deciduousness could be a form of flexibility, because you get some plants, depending on where it is, it could be evergreen or deciduous, depending on which part of Africa it's in, based on the amount of water that there is. And then you get tolerance traits as well, such as fat storage, where animals are able to store fats, which they will use up during the dry season, and then gain the fat back when the wet season comes back. Or something like deep roots in plants, for example, where plants will have access to deep to water in which they normally wouldn't have access to. So these traits over here, this is not a definitive list, just to clear it out, but I'm also still looking for more experts to contribute to this, so I would be glad to speak about this after this. So then going back to the different strategies that we spoke about, the one thing that we realized during the workshop as well is that it was very difficult to be able to group these into these particular groups, because if I asked someone else, they would be able to put one of these traits I may have put in a specific group in another group. So we thought that maybe this could be a sliding scale, where avoidance is the one end of the spectrum and tolerance is the other end of the spectrum, and then the traits fall somewhere within the middle of those, within that scale. And also it depends on the amount of water that is required. So those organisms that have high water requirements are more likely to be avoiders, and those that have low water requirements are more likely to be tolerators. Also, the other thing that we're realizing just from these results based on these colors is that more animals are avoiders and more plants are tolerators, which makes sense because animals cannot run anyway. So then it brings to a couple of questions which I'd like to ask. So is seasonality a stress? As you can see, these buffaloes here, there's nothing, it's really dry. Is it a stress compared to a drought, for example? Because seasonality is something that is predictable all the time. You know that it's something that's going to come every year compared to a drought. Or is seasonality also an opportunity? So based on this picture over here, you can see that there's some opane trees that are over there which make use of the ability to be able to mobilize water during the dry season, as well as capture nitrogen at the same time, at a time when other plants are not able to do that. And also this also brings about some of the other traits that could be associated with resource pulses. for example, what if it rains during the dry season? Are there traits that enable animals to be able to take advantage of that particular rain, or plants as well? So which also adds another question is, can we also have a fourth category which speaks about traits that speak about being able to take advantage of favorable conditions during a dry season? So after I've explained all this, so what is next? So one of the things which we would like to do is to be able to test the selection of these traits to investigate if they are indeed linked to seasonality, or they're also or they could be linked to other aspects of an animal's survival. So one of the ways which we're going to do is we're working with herbivore data, looking at diet switching in mammalian herbivores, and looking at the patterns of mixed feeding currently to see where those patterns emerge. Do they emerge in seasonal environments? And are they associated with seasonality? And also try and reconstruct them on a fossil record. Or also going to use plot data as well to do that, to look at which plants are found in seasonal environments and what traits do those plants have. Just touch a bit on seasonality. So these are the seasonality measures which I am using for this particular purpose. So the first one that you have over there is the length of the dry season. It just counts the number of months where the precipitation is above, the potential evaporation is above the amount of precipitation. Then you get the rainfall concentration index over there, where it takes into account the total amount of rainfall and also how spread the rainfall is. So for example, if the rainfall concentration index is 100, it means that all the rain is in one month. And then if it's a rainfall index of 0, it's spread out throughout the year. So that's how we know which parts of Africa are seasonal. And then there's also an index which we also developed, which is the number of growth days, which looks at that number of potential days when a plant can grow, which takes into account the soil type, the soil moisture as well. So you can see that most of the aseasonal parts are the lighter colors in these particular maps, except for this one where it's red, and the aseasonal parts are the blue parts. So going back to what I just said before with the mixed feeders and as well as the plot data, we'll be trying to see where those occur and if they actually match up with these particular maps that we have over here. And then also the other thing that we'd like to do is, if we do find out if they are associated with seasonality, then we can look back in time using phylogenetic and paleoecological data to see if if and when those traits actually emerged. Just like to take a moment to acknowledge Bob was also one of my supervisors in this particular project and gave us guidance in this project. And also acknowledge the people that were involved in the expert workshop that took place, and also provided comments on the various aspects. Thank you very much.
Cool. Thank you so much, Mto. Does anyone have any questions? We have about a minute or two. No? Okay. I think that's all. Thanks so much, Mto Kuzisi. Next up, we have Michelle Greve, and she'll be looking at traits of savanna seeds and seedlings and how they link to woody establishment. Thank you, Michelle.
Okay, thank you very much. Can you hear me? Right, I'm actually presenting the work of Laura, who's my student and couldn't be here. And her project is about how providence affects seedling traits. So actually, Mto's presentation was a perfect introduction to some of what we've been doing. The trees in savannas are limited by 3 main factors: aridity, fire, and herbivory. All of these slow down growth and can prevent establishment, and are therefore also important in determining tree-grass ratios in savannas. And they have different impacts on the environment, so for example, on trees. So for example, aridity results in limited water availability for the plant, which can result in slower growth, xylem cavitation, and desiccation-induced stem death. Fire results in above-ground biomass loss and heat-induced damage, and herbivory and defoliation, and sometimes other above-ground structural damage. So how are trees adapted to dealing with these limitations? For aridity, plants can reduce leaf investment to minimize water loss. They can have more below-ground dry mass or greater root length to maximize water absorption, and reduce xylem conduit diameter to prevent xylem cavitation. Adaptations to herbivory include a lower leaf-shoot ratio and thicker stem, as well as cagey architecture. And adaptations to resprouting can be, again, a greater below-ground investment, but also a greater leaf-shoot ratio because the plant can recover more quickly from a disturbance. And in response to fire, plants can have increased height, so grow faster in order to more quickly escape the fire trap. Also have a greater stem diameter and bark thickness in order to tolerate heat, and then have more below-ground investment, and again a greater leaf-shoot ratio as a resprouting adaptation. So the seedling stage is a major bottleneck actually in the establishment of trees, because many seedlings are limited in their recruitment. So the aim of our study here was to assess whether aridity, fire, and herbivory drive trait variation and trait syndromes in seedlings. We chose to grow seedlings of the mimosoids because we wanted to minimize phylogenetic non-independence, and because the mimosoids are one of 3 predominant woody taxa in African savannas. And we had 12 different species. These species range from fairly wet, species that occur in fairly wet conditions to dry conditions, and they also came from different herbivory and fire gradients. And then we grew them, we knew the exact age, and we measured a bunch of traits on the seedlings at 60 days. I'll just briefly go through the traits. We had stem length and stem diameter as size measures, the leaf shoot ratio, height of the lowest bud, leaf area and specific leaf area. We also measured xylem conduit diameter and inner and relative bark thickness. We had a bunch of below ground traits too. We had the depth of the stem root transition, all of those were below ground, the depth of the 5th lateral root as a measure of root architecture, root length and root diameter, and then we also counted and weighed the nodules. And then finally we had some whole plant traits. These included total plant biomass, the root shoot ratio to assess the relative contribution to above and below ground traits, and seed mass. Right, and then for each species, we extracted environmental conditions in which they occur. So we extracted locality records from GBIF for these species, and then we could get information about the conditions that each of our species grow in. And we had 3 measures of aridity, mean annual precipitation, rainfall seasonality, and we had a standardized precipitation evapotranspiration index, which is a measure of drought severeness. And we had fire radiative power to quantify fire effects. We did also want to look at fire return interval, but that was highly correlated with mean annual precipitation. And then finally, browser biomass index. We got that data from Gareth. And the first thing we wanted to see is whether we have potential trade-offs in traits, because we know from adult trees that if they, for example, invest a lot in size or in height, they might invest less in diameter, or they might invest less in caginess. So we expected to see some trade-offs at the seedling stage, and we didn't. So what we did see was that there was a positive correlation between seed size and a bunch of other traits, and particularly traits that relate to the size of the seedlings. So then we reran our analyses, and we included seed size as a predictor variable, thinking that maybe now we would get some trade-offs, but we still didn't. So we didn't find, at least for the traits that we were looking at, we didn't see any evidence for trade-offs at this young age. Next, we wanted to evaluate how environmental variables drive variation in traits. And we did 2 analyses. We ran analyses that tested the effect of our limiting factors on traits, on individual traits, using OLS and PGLS regressions. And we also ran a redundancy analysis. And I think I made a mistake in my presentation here, but just ignore that. So I'm not going to show you the individual results because there's many of them, but I just summarized what we found here. So we found that plants that grow in arid environments tend to have a greater seedling biomass and taller stems, and also a greater rooting depth. And these were all traits that are also highly related to seed mass. So we think that the fact that these plants tend to have large seeds is driving that. They had a reduced leaf production. This is a adaptation to prevent or to reduce transpiration. They invested more in below ground material than above ground material. And they also had a deeper depth of expansion, so the fifth lateral root was lower. So they were probably try to get their water reserves from deeper down in the soil. When we looked at adaptations to fire, we didn't find a lot of interesting patterns. So we found that they generally had low seed mass. They did prioritize leaf production to shoot investment, which is one adaptation to resprouting. But other than that, we found nothing that really seemed to predict the ability, or would explain why they would do well in high fire environments. And we found a similar result for species that came from areas with high browser pressure, except maybe that they had increased SLA, so that can also be used as a variable to, or a trait that's indicative of species growing faster. But they also had reduced seedling biomass accumulation and small seeds. And then finally, we wanted to know whether certain traits tend to always group together, so whether we have trait complexes, and we used a hierarchical clustering technique for this. And then we tested which traits differ between the clusters using a t-test, and then also whether we have environmental differences between the clusters. We had 2 clusters. I'll call them the blue cluster and the red cluster. And the clusters separated out based on stem length, stem diameter, xylem conduit diameter, above ground mass, and root diameter. And all of those traits were bigger in this red cluster than in the blue cluster. And when we tried to see whether those plants come from different environments, the only predictive variable that came out as significant was drought severity. So these red species are from areas that have greater drought severity. So this is not a seasonality measure, but it's a measure of how extreme droughts are when they do happen. And the species that we have in here are both species that occur in fairly dry areas, as well like Vachellia areoloba, but there are also species from wetter areas like Vachellia kuru and robusta. So what we can conclude from this is that there don't seem to be, at this very young age, there don't seem to be trade-offs in traits yet. And the species seem to be adapted to arid environments when they grow in arid environments. But there don't seem to be many or any major adaptations to either of the disturbance factors that we looked at. And what we think is happening here is that in arid environments, the species or the seedlings that grow there are always exposed to drier conditions. And so if they don't have those adaptations, they just won't make it. So they need to invest in large seeds, in deeper roots, in less investment in leaves. Whereas in these areas with high disturbance, the seedlings, I think the strategy is that the tree just produces many smaller seeds and hopes that some of those that germinate will be able to establish and will not be exposed to a disturbance event. And so I think they seem to have very different strategies. And then finally we had some development of trait syndromes, but they were only related to drought severity at this very young age. All right, thank you very much.
Cool. Thanks so much, Michelle. Do you have any questions? Susie and welcome, William. I haven't seen you all week. But Susie, we'll give the mic to Susie first.
Thanks. So no differences in the bark thickness?
No, not at, so they were 60 days old, but we didn't find differences in bark thickness. So I think at this young age, they just, also you can imagine a seedling that's 60 days old is unlikely to actually be exposed to at least fire. So it might be exposed to herbivory, but it might be a few months before it's exposed to fire. Yes.
Okay, cool. William.
When I've looked at those arid adapted acacias, or the ones that grow in arid areas, they're typically cohorted, and they seem to come up in unique years. Those years presumably being the really wet ones. So why bother to adapt to drought?
Maybe for the next year, I don't know. So what I've seen is just from doing experiments that if you give an Acacia rheoloba, for example, if you give it a bit of water, it will germinate immediately. So I think what we've seen is that the trees with larger seeds do germinate very early, and then the roots grow fast. So we were pulling seedlings out. After 2 days, their roots were maybe 20 to 30 centimeters deep. So I think if they have these very large seeds, then they can invest a lot in putting their roots down deep very early on. I think that could be one strategy in this kind of environment.
One really interesting thing is that prosopis, which can grow in the same area, is not cohorted. It grows all the time. So to include prosopis as a comparative species, it's a bit late now, but it would have been great.
What's its seed size like?
See the prosopis?
Yes.
They're quite big.
Oh, they're big too.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, cool. Thanks so much, Michelle. Next up, we have Jocelyn Howard. She has a 5-minute presentation looking at basal bud banks as primary determinants of survival of woody legume seedlings. Thanks, Jocelyn.
Okay, good afternoon. So today I'll be presenting my honours research project on disturbance response in savanna legume seedlings. So as we all know, savannas have high levels of disturbance. Therefore, we expect the trees in these systems to have adaptations to herbivory and fire. Research done on these adaptations has mostly focused on adults and saplings or on one specific geographic area. Additionally, they have compared species across distant phylogenies. And of those that have looked at seedlings, have focused on them when they're quite a lot older and not when they're very young. So the aim of my project was to determine what traits allow 30-day-old mimosoid seedlings to survive above ground disturbance, and if survival differs between species from different providences. So we conducted an experiment with 12 legume species from the mimosoid family, thus controlling for phylogenetic non-dependence. And additionally, we selected species from different geographic areas, disturbance regimes, and climatic conditions. We simulated disturbance by clipping the individuals at 1 centimeter above the soil surface when they were 30 days old. We measured a variety of traits prior to clipping, all above ground, of course, stem diameter, stem length, height of the lowest bud, and we selected a subset of individuals which we harvested and measured below ground traits such as root diameter and depth of the stem root transition. Using a best subset method to create my models, I got the following results. Firstly, at the individual level, only one trait predicted survival, and that was the presence of buds below 1 centimeter. Individuals with buds below 1 centimeter were much more likely to survive, and of those that did not have buds below 1 centimeter, less than 40% survived. This pattern is reflected for different species, so Albizia fabaceae, had almost no individuals survive, and none had buds below 1 centimeter. Vachellia exuvialis, most survived and most had buds below 1 centimeter, and Vachellia robusta, all survived and all had buds below 1 centimeter. However, Dichostachys cinerea and Vachellia siberiana did not follow this pattern, and we're still not sure why. During our final measures, we cut seedlings at the soil surface and removed the below ground tissue, and we found something really interesting. We found leaves and spines below the soil surface in Vachellia seedlings. So we decided and we had not seen this in younger seedlings when we harvested them, so we decided to conduct an analysis using the change in height of the lowest bud between day 6 and day 60 of the control individuals. So, for each species, we calculated average change in height of the lowest bud, proportion buds below 1 centimeter, and proportion survived. And what we found is that with a greater decrease in the height of the lowest bud, proportion buds below 1 centimeter increased, and we found the same for survival. So a greater decrease in the height of the lowest bud meant a greater average survival for the species. Also just like to note that this was only in the Vachellia seedlings. Seedling survival did not differ between species of different providences. So to conclude, at 30 days old, bud height is key to seedling survival of disturbances. By keeping your buds below 1 centimeter, they're a lot less likely to be damaged or lost by disturbance, and we think that the lack of other predictors of survival are likely due to the young age of the seedlings and that they haven't had the chance to develop any other strategies. Additionally, the root contraction of Vachellia seedlings could be a method of decreasing bud height, thus increasing survival. So if an above ground disturbance occurs, they can still resprout quite quickly from their protected buds. I'd also just like to thank the NRF, the team at Innovation Africa at UP, and my fellow postgrads who helped with the experiment.
Cool. Thanks so much, Josie. We're out of time. Next up, we have Nikki Stevens, who will be taking us to the Mopani Veld, and we'll be looking at thresholds of disturbance and how they create sterile landscapes. Thanks, Nikki.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to give you a fascinating story about Mopani again. I feel like it's been underrepresented. So I'm going to be talking about how much disturbance actually determines the reproductive potential of a landscape, and I'm going to be talking about it in this fascinating tree. And Mopani, as you all know, is this beautiful tree that is very common in South Africa. And whilst it's not always the most popular tree out there in the world, it does present us with two very unique opportunities. One is that it has this incredible ability to be a monospecific species, and Mopani does a really good job of that. And if you look at this beautiful picture, you see all the sticks that are sticking out there are actually Mopani. So that's really nice, because when you look at a landscape, you know what's going on, and you know it's all just Mopani. And the other nice benefit is that it's really common, especially in Southern Africa. So if you understand Mopani, you understand a lot about what's happening in Southern Africa. And also, I mean, we all work in savannas. We've been told countless times how important demography is, and we know within the savanna perspective, understanding the demography is really important in understanding the structure and function and processes of savannas. And like many savanna trees, Mopani is no different. It has very similar patterns where the demographic bottlenecks lie. And so Mopani is no different. It has very little limitations when it comes to the seed stage. It produces a lot of seeds. There's not a lot of pre-seed dispersal, pre or post-seed dispersal predation. Mopani germinates incredibly easily, so germination is not a clear bottleneck. But what's determined, one of the first bottlenecks that it experiences for the transition from early germinant to an established seedling, and that is determined by how much rainfall there is. So that's great, but still many Mopani seeds manage to successfully establish, as we can tell by the large amounts of Mopani. And then Mopani seedlings go on to transition to saplings. The The transition to a sapling stage is determined by amount of grass biomass, both through grass competition, but also it determines how much disturbance Mopani seedlings and saplings experience. So that's all good. None of this is particularly different from many other savanna tree species. But what is really interesting about Mopani, and I've mentioned this before, is at some point there's some level of threshold, some threshold of disturbance which determines the architecture of the tree. So if the tree at some point through any of these demographic stages experiences some level of disturbance, it experiences this change in trajectory in terms of its architecture. So if it experiences a high level of top kill, it transitions to this level of this architecture, which is this short multi-stemmed shrub. If it manages to have a relatively peaceful existence and not experience too much top kill, it has the tendency to form this single-stemmed, tall, beautiful tree. So that's great. But the problem with this is you've got two different architectural types, but it has significant relevance for the reproductive potential of the population. So this is some data that Sally and I gathered, is that if you look at tree height and you measure how many seeds each tree each are produced by tree height, you'll notice that short trees don't produce seeds. And even if you do produce seeds at this critical threshold of 4 meters, where they start reluctantly agreeing to produce seeds, they only produce very few. So on the y-axis, this is our seed index. Our index of 1 means the tree is producing between 0 to 100 seeds. An index of 4 means that the tree is producing in excess of about 10,000 seeds. So even though it's producing seeds at 4 meters, it's producing very few. But then as your tree growing taller, it starts producing a lot of seeds. So height becomes really significant in determining the reproductive potential of this population. So the question that I want to answer is, how much disturbance do you have to transition between these two, the reproductive lifestyle or the non-reproductive lifestyle? So yeah, how much disturbance do you need? And what's the threshold of disturbance that determines this transition? And because we were sitting in the Kruger Park, the two disturbance agents that are the obvious suspects are the presence of herbivores, particularly elephants, and the action of fire. And for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about fire. And this brings us to the experimental burn plots. The neglected cousins of the southern burn plots are the Mopani experimental burn plots. And this is a fabulous resource. We've got 4 replicated burn strings in this monospecific Mopani felt, all on basalts. And we have this beautiful opportunity to study this range of disturbances on Mopani felt. So the burn frequency varies between a control, which was generally very low burn frequencies, all the way through to annual. And we've got this huge variety in burn season. So that allows us to start teasing apart the levels of the burn frequency and intensity, and what's this threshold of disturbance that causes this transition between the two. And it would have been really tedious to go and actually measure all of this. So enter the Andrew Davies lab, and who've been flying these LiDAR on these plots. So that gives us the opportunity to count the individual number of trees and have the height of all these trees occurring within these plots. So I'm going to ask these 2 very simple questions. What is the burn season, which is a proxy for fire intensity? How does this affect Mopani height profiles? This is quite simple. The control plots, which are over there, which are not ever burnt, are much taller than plots that have some level of burn. And of course, season matters. The hotter fires have the general rule that the hotter fires produce smaller trees and the cooler fires produce slightly taller trees. Okay. The next question is, what does burn frequency do? Similar pattern. If you don't burn them, they tend to be taller. And you have the general pattern. I'm just making some generalizations here. You have the general pattern is the lower the frequency, the taller the trees. That's great, but I'm not really interested in about what determines Mopani height. I want to know how many sterile trees there are in the landscape, so how many trees are actually above 4 meters. So if we do some logistic regressions here, we get some basic answers. that, so if you look at this middle line, if you're occurring on this side, that means there's more sterility in the landscape, and if you're occurring on that side, it means there's less sterility in the landscape. And generally, burn plots with hotter fires, high-frequency fires, have more sterility, and if you never burnt or you have cool fires, there's less sterility. So that's great. Now we know about fire frequency and fire intensity and sterility. So the next question is, does this really matter? And I'm actually going to say no, not at all. Because if you actually look at the numbers, the vast, vast, vast majority of the trees in these landscapes are all sterile. And the most overwhelming significant difference is a difference in between the control and the winter plots, where a whopping 2.3% of the trees are producing seeds versus 0.5% of the trees producing seeds. And many of these trees are actually just at 4 meters. So there's not a lot of seeds being produced in these landscapes at all. So sure, fire contributes to the variation of sterility in the landscape, but does it really matter? Yeah, probably not. So this takes us to the next suspect, which I don't have the data to analyze, but I'll do a bit of speculation. This is outside, well, this is in the Kruger Park matrix where elephants occur, and this is Mopani Veld. You can see they're quite short. And this is in the Rhone enclosure, which haven't had elephants, and you can see they're quite tall. This is a height profile with thousands and thousands and thousands of trees measured by LiDAR, which show that most of the trees are below 4 meters. This is data that Sally and I collected with huge amounts of effort, and all 110 data points show that trees tend to be much taller when you don't have elephants in the landscape. So obviously we're actually going to analyze this properly using the next round of LiDAR that's being collected. There's this fabulous resource of these herbivore exclusion plots within the park, in the Mopani Veld, but we also have this really nice opportunity of looking at our neighboring areas. In Limpopo National Park, we have this consistent history of very low elephants, and in the neighboring areas within South Africa, we also have landscapes filled with Mopani that have no elephant but have some levels of human disturbance and some cattle and whatever. So we can start teasing apart the role of herbivory quite clearly, and then make a more coherent story of fire and herbivory and how this affects these sterile landscapes. So I've been talking about these results, and people say to me, well, should we be concerned about Mopani? No, I really don't think we should be concerned about Mopani. There's a lot of it, we're fine. But it does tell us some really interesting things. This is a really good model system to hint what's probably happening in many savanna tree species, and I think that's something worth looking at. Understanding the relevance of this, I think one of the big gaps in our understanding is actually understanding how long trees live in savannas. And obviously a lot of this that we're seeing is some legacy effects. So actually I think that's an important gap. But I think ultimately the results are going to show how important mega herbivores are at a landscape scale. And I think the widespread extirpation of large herbivores across landscapes has actually some really large implications for our understanding. We know that mega herbivores are really important in the structure and biomass of vegetation, and that can be important in reducing woody encroachment. But I think they also have a really important role in acting as an absolute filter in the presence and absence of plants. And I think understanding the role of mega herbivores, actually in understanding species distributions, is an underestimated or explored avenue. And I feel like we really have underestimated the scale of this widespread removal of mega herbivores across Africa. And I think I will stop there. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you, Nikki. Any questions? There's Jessie and the OTS student. I'll give you my mic.
You know I love Mopani almost as much as you, maybe not quite, but similar. My question is about seed viability. You show the nice relationship with seed number, but a lot of times when plants undergo disturbance and they have less seed, they can allocate more resources like carbohydrates and nitrogen to a smaller number, therefore viability is higher. Do you have any estimates on changes in viability with seed height?
seemingly, the viability of Mopani seeds is quite short. Ideally, they need to germinate within their first year of existence. That said, I mean, I've also managed to lose some Mopani seeds and like have them lying around my house and then germinate them a while later, but that's sitting in. So I think the viability of seeds, the longevity of seeds is very low. Viability of seeds, because there's so many, I feel like it's quite high. And I don't think that this is ever going to be a significant limitation, especially even if they're quite low in terms of viability, that when they do produce seeds, they produce so many.
Okay, cool. Okay, next question is Gomotso. I confirmed. Her name is Gomotso, not the ODS student.
So I wanted to ask, is the Mopani tree the only tree whose sterility is determined by its height or growth form?
We have a postdoc working on this, and no, it's not. There are quite a few species that have this relationship, and I think the relationship's not strictly related to height, but I think there are a lot of trees, especially the tall, what you would typically associate with as a tall tree. Many of those trees have this seem to have this relationship.
Okay, cool. Then I have one question that I'm going to squeeze in. Your tall Mopanis, where did you sample that? Because I see that your shrub Mopanis, I'm guessing you collected in the Gabbro section of the park. Your tall Mopanis, because they look like Instagram Mopanis, actually.
So
Where
the
were
picture
they?
of Mopanis are not from here, the green ones. But we sampled them in the camps and the Rhone camps. I mean, I imagine if we spent more time, we would find them along the rivers and probably along some of the drainage lines and some of the roads. There seem to be taller Mopanis. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, because we just had a question, where's Collie, about that and the different soil types and the soil moistures, but we can talk about that afterwards. Cool. Thanks so much, Nikki.
Sure.
Okay, next up we have Michelle Grieve again. She'll be presenting on behalf of Samantha Jamison Daniels. We'll be looking at comparing the drivers of fruit in phenology of dry-fruited and fleshy fruit. That's a tongue twister. Fleshy, okay, trees.
Thank you. Yes, so this is from my student Sam's PhD. So phenology is the timing of life history events, and phenology affects virtually all aspects of ecology and evolution. So for example, plants will flower once the frost has passed, or pollinators will emerge when their host plants flower. So biological processes and patterns really depend on phenology. And the study of phenology has become particularly important in a changing world because a lot of phenological patterns are determined by climate. So if climate changes, we expect that phenological patterns change, and therefore also the interactions of the organisms whose phenology change with other organisms is also affected. So we expect sort of cascading effects. A lot of plant-based phenological studies focus on flowering and leafing phenology, but much less attention has been given to fruiting phenology. This despite the fact that fruiting phenology is very important for seed dispersers, for whom it can make up a huge part of their food source, and also for seed dispersal, so for the plant itself. So in angiosperms, a wide variety of fruit types and forms exist. They've evolved several fruit attributes to increase the effectiveness and quality of their seed dispersal. So these can include variation in seed size and color, nutritional attributes, presence of accessory structures, and also whether the fruits are fleshy and dry. So we would expect that different fruit types develop and do well under different conditions based on their morphology and anatomy. So we can divide fruits very broadly into two categories, fleshy fruits and dry fruits, and they have different characteristics. So fleshy fruits tend to store a lot of water, and therefore they require water for fruit production. But that also means that when it gets very cold, that ice crystals can form in the fruit and lead to cell damage. This is in contrast to dry fruited species, which generally require less water to be produced, but they also require a period of dryness in order to ripen. And they can also generally withstand cold conditions better because they're not prone to the formation of ice crystals. Therefore, we would expect that dry and fleshy fruited species should have different requirements for fruit production, and that's what we set out to test in this study. We had 3 different objectives. The first one was to test whether fleshy and dry fruited species show different seasonal peaks in fruiting phenology. Then we wanted to know whether different climatic variables influence the fruiting phenology of dry and fleshy fruited species. And then finally, we wanted to know whether the total contribution of different climatic variables to phenology differ between dry and fleshy fruited species. We chose 58 widespread and fairly common species from across South Africa. We chose species from the summer rainfall area, and those that also extended into the winter rainfall area, we excluded the records from the winter and the all-year-round rainfall area. And then we collected phenology data from herbarium specimens. So for each herbarium specimen that we considered, we needed to have the collection date, so day, month, and year. We had accurate or fairly accurate locality information, and then we scored fruiting presence and absence, and if possible, maturity, but that wasn't always possible. And then because phenology data is not linear data, but circular data, we use the 1st of June as the first day of the season. I'm not going to go into reasons for that, but if you're interested, you can ask me. So we ended up, we examined 3,864 specimens, of which about half were fleshy and the other ones, half were dry fruited species. So to answer the first question, whether we have different seasonal peaks in fruiting phenology, we expected that dry fruited species would fruit in the dry season and fleshy fruited species in the wet season. So we calculated the mode fruiting day of the year, and then we compared this between the dry and fleshy fruited species. And we did indeed find that the fleshy fruited species fruited earlier than the dry fruited species. So the 1st of December was the sort of the average across species for fleshy fruited, and the 5th of March for dry fruited. All of this was a bit earlier than expected, but yeah, that's what we found. And then we wanted to know whether different climatic variables influence fruiting phenology of the 2 groups, and we expected that fleshy fruited species tend to fruit during periods of, fruit in areas, no, fleshy fruited species do better in areas of higher precipitation and temperature, and dry fruited species in areas of lower precipitation and temperature. So again, we used GBIF records to extract a bunch of climatic variables, and we excluded highly collinear variables, but these variables are basically precipitation and temperature variables, and then we included solar and wind. We then ran generalized additive models to assess how climate influences the fruiting day of dry and fleshy fruited species, and we used an interaction term between fruit type and climate predictors because we were specifically interested to see whether there were different patterns for the two fruit types. So this is what we found. We have a red asterisk, it's a significant result. So we found, and I'm only showing the significant variables. Mean temperature of the coldest month only had an effect on fruiting phenology of fleshy fruit. So in areas that get very cold in the cold period, the phenology is earlier, so they fruit earlier than in warmer areas. Temperature seasonality affected both dry and fleshy fruited species phenology, and for both of them, the fruiting was later under higher temperature seasonality. And then precipitation of the driest quarter only predicted the phenology of dry fruited species, where dry fruited species tended to fruit earlier if there was lower precipitation of the driest quarter. Temperature of the warmest quarter affected only fleshy fruit, and we found that fleshy fruit tended to fruit earlier when the temperature of the warmest quarter was low, and when it was high. And then higher solar radiation resulted in earlier fruiting phenology for both dry and fleshy fruit. And then for the last question, we wanted to know whether the total contribution of different climatic variables to phenology differ between dry and fleshy fruited species. So here we just expected that, for example, if you have a fleshy fruited species and the temperature in winter is important, for one species, it would be important for other species also. So we used the percentage contribution of each climatic variable to the GAM models, and we compared those, we did random forest regressions here, and we compared those between fleshy and dry fruited species. And we didn't find a significant difference here in the contribution of climatic variables to fleshy and dry fruited species. So we did indeed find that fleshy fruited species fruit earlier than dry fruited species, as we expected. But we found that there are different drivers for fleshy and dry fruited species phenology. So both showed similar responses to temperature seasonality and solar radiation. So if you have higher solar radiation, the fruit ripens earlier, that makes sense. And in areas with higher temperature seasonality, the fruiting would be later. So we thought that this could be because if there's a big difference in temperature between summer and winter, the plants would have to switch to, like from a winter mode to a summer mode before they start fruiting, whereas if the temperatures are quite similar, they are able to fruit earlier. And then winter precipitation was important for the phenology of dry fruit. So we found that if you have dry winters, the fruiting phenology is earlier. So this is interesting because in general, dry fruited species require less water to develop, but this appears to suggest that if you have very dry winters, they still have to bring their fruiting phenology earlier because they obviously need some water for the fruit to develop. And then we found that winter temperature was important for fleshy fruit. So if you have very cold winters, the fleshy fruit tends to fruit earlier, and that's perhaps an adaptation to prevent, or an adaptation against frost. And we had this very weird result where at both high and low summer temperatures, you have early fruiting phenology, and we don't know how to explain that. All right, and then we also found that there's no one climatic variable that's consistently more important for predicting fruiting phenology in one fruit type versus the other. So obviously this can have implications under climate change scenarios, so we expect that dry and fleshy fruited species will respond differently under climate change. So for example, the fact that temperature of the coldest month is very important in determining fruiting phenology of fleshy fruited species suggests that if we have warmer winters, that the fleshy fruited species might end up fruiting later. So there may be more food availability for the consumers of fleshy fruited species under that scenario. But also if we have drier winters, then the dry fruited species might fruit earlier, and they are quite an important food source for many animals during the dry season when very little other food is available. So then that source of high quality food can disappear. And thank you very much.
Cool. Thank you so much. We have a couple of minutes for some questions if anyone has. Corley? Yeah, Corley.
Thank you so much. This is very interesting. I was just wondering if you expect to find more of the fleshy fruit at a higher precipitation, do you then, at the same price you would expect the fleshy fruit to make fruit then when you have higher rainfall? But if I'm just trying to think of Kruger, we seem to see fleshy fruit quite consistently, but some of the, say, combretums, they only very occasionally fruit. So I was just wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
I didn't hear what you said about the combretum.
So they, something like Zyri, they only fruit not very occasionally. So only after we've been tracking some of the trees, I would say once out of 6 years when it's a very good rainfall year. So I'm a bit surprised why non-fleshy fruit will wait for good rain?
So you're asking why non-fleshy fruit will wait for big rain? Is that what you said? Yeah. So we didn't actually find that mean annual precipitation predicted any of the phenology of the fruiting type, even though we did include it in our models. So I assume that there are these, fruiting. I think our results show that dry fruited species are also dependent on rainfall, just by the fact that if you have a very dry season, then they have to fruit earlier. So I assume, they also do need water in order for the fruits to develop. I don't know if that answers your questions.
Okay. You guys might just need to discuss that a bit further later. Okay, so next up we have Susie Vetter. Susie, I hope you know that there might be load shedding now at 3, hey? Do you know that?
I'll talk really fast then.
But if it does go out, you can give us an interpretive dance of your talk. Until the lights come back on. So Susie will be taking us down to the Eastern Cape, and we'll be talking about bark investment and growth allometries. Thanks so much, Susie.
Thank you. I really wondered for most of this meeting what I had done to deserve the graveyard shift. And then I realized it's this really dry and unimaginative title. That must have been it. So I've learned my lesson. So this is a project that came out of brewing up collaboration with Julieta Rosell and Mark Olson from Mexico that would somehow combine my interest in thicket clump formation in savannas and the traits of the species involved, and their fascination with bark and bark thickness. So I'm sure you're familiar with this process or have come across it. At previous Savanna Network meetings, there have been a couple of talks about it. But in some cases, when woody encroachment occurs, you go from a state of isolated savanna trees that establish within the grassy matrix and live in an environment of frequent low-intensity fires. And you then, in some places, get the establishment of these shrubs that establish under-established trees, so often in an environment with slightly more shady, slightly more humid, possibly less grass biomass. And as they grow up, the thicket clumps expand and they often coalesce. And you can end up with a complete biome shift to closed canopy thicket that is then fire-free. And this occurs in a number of different places. So this here is in Ghana, in the coastal savannas, and this is here in the Eastern Cape. And it seems that these guys here are really important in driving this transition because they can establish in the fire-prone environment, but they are instrumental in turning it into a fire-free one. And given the importance of fire in maintaining this threshold between the open and the closed canopy states, the fire tolerance traits of thicket clump pioneer species are of particular interest to us anyway. Now, fire tolerance can involve a suite of traits, including having thicker bark for a given size, that protects the dormant buds that are often also buried more deeply within the bark, but also as
Quick.
I'm ready.
So Kath Gordon's MSc, she worked on megafaunal fruits, and they are tropical was the main thing, so they wouldn't have that cold season. And I think they'd be very interesting to look at, and what is their phenology when you uncouple from, they're mostly fleshy. I saw that you had a sausage tree up there, and do you really think that that's the timing of the fruit there is linked to temperature or anything like that? And then it raises the question, to what extent is fruit ripening linked to when animals are most going to benefit? When you see cattle running for Acacia ciberana pods in the dry season, that is the time to have your pods out.
It seems like this fruiting story is quite complex. And I know Susie's standing up there for a while again, so I think maybe if you can answer William directly afterward.
Can be via a number of different mechanisms. The obvious one is insulation, and potentially outer bark might play a bigger role in this, protecting the cambium from being destroyed, but also the xylem from catastrophic embolism and the bud bank from being killed off. The water content of the bark through its latent heat can also help with insulation. And potentially the carbohydrates stored in the inner bark might aid in recovery after damage. Now, bark thickness has generally been seen as something that protects against fire. Pretty much every study that has compared forest trees with savanna trees between regions and within mosaics has found that savanna trees have got thicker bark. But according to Julieta, it gets a lot more complicated than that. She did a study of some 670 species from sites spanning from arid to mesic and all sorts of climatic conditions. And there is a general and also well-known allometry between stem diameter and bark thickness. When she disaggregated this into inner bark thickness and outer bark thickness, inner bark thickness is very tightly coupled to stem diameter, whereas outer bark, the relationship is much looser. And she interpreted this as being because of the much tighter metabolic constraints on the thickness of a living tissue. And when she analyzed what explained the residuals of these relationships for inner and outer bark, she found thicker than expected inner bark tended to occur in hot and dry environments, and she interpreted this as inner bark contributing mostly to storage, whereas outer bark, thicker than expected, was very much linked to fire-prone environments. So we decided to compare bark and some other related traits of thicket pioneer, savanna, and closed canopy species at two sites. So the one is in the Eastern Cape, about 730 millimeters of rainfall, fire-prone, but fires, in fact, are relatively infrequent. And then Buffelskloof in Mpumalanga, which is much more mesic and has got much higher fire frequency and probably intensity. And we picked 9 species from each site based on, so savanna species were those that were found to establish on their own in the grassy matrix. Pioneers were those that recruited predominantly under established trees but within the grass, and the closed canopy ones were the ones that we found recruiting in the closed canopy. And we got busy with the saw, hammer, and chisel, and we measured height and stem diameter and then the thickness of inner and outer bark. So we did intra-specific allometry. So these relationships here were of the biggest individuals across species, but what we did is get the slopes and elevation of these allometries for each species by measuring the tiniest to the biggest individual. And we also measured the density and water content of wood, inner and total bark, and we recorded the total leaf length. And what we predicted is that the savanna, pioneer, and closed canopy species would separate out, with the pioneers being intermediate. We expected outer bark to show the allometries to show the most pronounced difference, if that is the one that really contributes to fire tolerance, whereas the inner bark we predicted would scale more tightly with stem diameter and maybe have some difference, especially since savanna trees do experience more water stress. We also expected a greater stem diameter for a given height in the savanna species. And then if that was the case, together with a greater stem diameter specific bark thickness, we would expect that savanna trees would reach a sort of critical bark thickness of, say, 0.5 centimeter, which often comes up in the literature as allowing 50% survival from top kill, at a height below 2 meters, or they would reach critical bark thickness for a smaller size. But this has to be achieved somehow, so we also predicted that if this was the case, it would be made possible by savanna species having relatively cheaper, low-density tissues. So here are our allometries. Each thin line is a species. The thick lines are the ecological group. And then this is always the Eastern Cape and the Buffelskloof site, and this is everyone combined. So for outer bark, The forest species had a really low slope. I'm sure that doesn't surprise anybody. The pioneers were remarkably similar to the savanna species, but at the more fire-prone sites, the savanna species really had a steep slope. And as with the overall analysis, it's much more messy. The inner bark showed much tighter relationship, as we also predicted, but also a very clear hierarchy from savanna, pioneer, and closed canopy species. And together, making up the total bark thickness, which is often what's measured as in relation to fire, the savanna species, as expected, had steeper and higher slopes for the overall allometry. So that's all very well, but what does this translate to in terms of critical thresholds? Because a lot of fire resistance really matters when you're less than 2 meters tall. So here is stem diameter and here total bark thickness estimated for a 2 meter high individual. And savanna trees had much thicker stems, with the pioneers being intermediate, but especially nicely, I thought, they all had at least 5 millimeters of bark by the time they reached a height of 2 meters, with the pioneers not quite being there, and the forest species, very little bark. And then we sort of turn this around to see what is the stem diameter or the height of the individual that it needs to reach by the time it reaches this critical bark thickness of 5 millimeters. And shame, those forest trees, they had to have a stem of, on average, 30 centimeters wide and had to reach a height of some 10 meters before they got 5 centimeters of bark. But the savanna trees, reached it really quickly, at less than 5 centimeters thick and at less than 2 meters tall. And here the pioneers actually come out much more similar. And we also did find that the savanna trees had the lowest wood density, and that wood density and the stem diameter at 2 meter height were quite well correlated with water content, which we measured in fully saturated samples, showing the opposite trend. And similarly, total bark thickness at 2 meter height was significantly correlated with the density of the bark tissue. So, as we expected, a cheaper tissue allows them to reach that greater thickness and diameter. And when we did a cluster analysis, as one does, for all the traits combined, these are the really hardcore thick bark species of the Buffelskloof savannas. Here we've got predominantly savanna species and a couple of the Buffelskloof pioneers. Here we've got the forest species or the closed canopy species with their wussy bark and skinny stems. And most of the drier site pioneers came out closer here. So the pattern overall, if you combine all these traits, was also as expected. So to conclude, savanna species had greater bark investment for a given stem diameter and a greater stem diameter for a given height. And so together that means that by the time they reached 2 meters, they had bark that is, in many studies, sort of the threshold where half of you can survive, or at least not be top killed. And they also had the lowest wood and bark density, suggesting that these cheaper tissues made that possible. In contrast, the closed canopy species had really skinny stems and thin bark and much denser tissues, and the thicket pioneers were intermediate, but more similar to the savanna species. And also, the wetter site with the higher fire intensity had slightly thicker barked pioneers. So that supports the observation that thicket pioneer species are moderately fire tolerant, and that sort of hot fires occasionally are probably required to limit their expansion. There's a whole lot of interesting questions that remain. I mean, I think we need to test the proof of the pudding and actually burn these guys. But I think it also raises interesting questions about the relative role and function of inner versus outer bark. I think the outer bark is kind of obvious, but the inner bark might be a much more complicated story. Thank you.
Cool. Thanks so much, Susie. We have a minute or two for any questions, if anyone has. Sally. I saw Sally's clap was technically a hand up. Did you see she clapped?
I mean, if someone else has a question. Thanks, that was lovely data. Is there any evidence that having water in your bark is also better insulation than having wood in your, like if you've got a thick bark that's dense versus a thick bark that's full of water, which is better insulation against a fire?
So Steve Higgins and a bunch of co-authors wrote this really cool paper published in 2012 where they looked at bark thickness, stem diameter, allometries, and a whole lot of bark and other traits in a whole bunch of the species in the different fire experiments. And one of the things they found was that higher bark moisture content was predicted a lower probability of top kill. And in the introduction, they cite some literature. It's apparently quite hotly debated. Like, is it that as the water evaporates, that latent heat, it might damage the bark, but it protects the stuff inside? So that's why I think it would be really cool to actually do some eco-phys on it and actually some experiments.
Okay, thanks so much, Susie. Just on that it being hotly debated, I mean, I have some observations also of some succulents like euphorbias. Like immediately after the fire, they look like they're fine, but go there a few months later and they're dead again. So I think it's just a slower response to the fire if it has a wetter bark. I don't know. Yeah, cool. Thank you, Susie. Okay, so that's the end of the talks for this session. Maybe we can just give them all a round of applause. So next up we have Llewellyn, who will give us a quick wrap-up of the last 4 days of the conference. Thanks, Llewellyn.
Thanks, Tertia. I noticed you said quick a bit louder, so I'll try and stick to that. So you stuck with me again, but I know everyone's tired, and I'm sure you got a cooler box full of drinks, and you're ready to go. And I can't see my talk. So, well, this is the 19th Savanna Science Network meeting. I actually thought it was the 16th. I had to ask Judith just to check. So somewhere in between, I lost a few years. So I made about I filled nearly 3 of these notebooks. And I'm not sure when I last listened to somebody talk so carefully. But as I was going through it, I quickly realized that there's so much information that comes out of this conference. It's so broad, there's so much detail that I definitely can't do justice to all of the information. In just a few short minutes. So I'm not going to try and follow that route. I'm going to just bring out some general thoughts that I have from over the last few days, and just some my own perspectives. And it's been said many times over the years that the Kruger Conference is one of the premier Savannah Science conferences. I think it still plays a big role, an important forum. There are many other conferences, but I think this has a really important place on